Okay. Now, something that I should have said before we even started chapter 3, and that's something very basic from management. And I didn't learn it until my first job as a manager, and that is what gets measured gets managed. What gets measured gets managed. And I'll start with a very simple thing. I've lost a lot of weight, and I struggle to keep my weight down. How often do you think I weigh? Say again? Weekly. She says weekly. Any other guesses?
Once a day.
Once a day, right? I get up first thing in the morning. Of course, I got to go to the bathroom. But then I weigh myself, right? And today I was up a little bit. So now the next thing is, do I just say up? No chocolate donuts for me today, right? I love those little chocolate donuts you get out of the vending machine. I love them. But none today because my weight was up. And I got this blazer tailor-made for me in China. It's starting to get a little tight. So I'm going to have to be careful about that, right? Okay, now, take that into the business world. What are the things that we're going to measure and manage? Well, when I worked at Halliburton, we had our 6 key initiatives, is what they referred to them as. We call them the Big 6. And they were speed, cost, safety, customer service, quality, and asset management. Now, do you think they told us that any of these were more important than any of the rest? No, these are 6 things that we're supposed to do, all of them, right? It's like juggling 6 balls at once. Now, we had measurements in each of these areas, and once per month, we would receive the official report. And we also, by the way, had a plan for all these things. And so the plan for the speed is measured in cycle time. That's how long it takes for something to go all the way through the manufacturing process. We were hoping for 30 days. If we were at 29 days, we were happy. If we were at 31, we knew we needed to do something. Does that make sense? And so for each one of these things, we had a plan out there, and we would see if we were falling down on the job or what we would call favorable to plan. So if our cost was below the goal, we were favorable to plan. If our accidents were below the goal, we were favorable to plan. If our promises kept, which was our measure of customer service, was above the goal, we were favorable to plan. And asset management, the only assets that I had to worry about really were inventory. If my inventory turns were above the goal, then I was favorable to plan. Now, what do you think the chances are that each and every month we were favorable to plan in all 6 areas? We weren't. How did we know where to concentrate our efforts? Well, first of all, we have an indicator here of what we need to work on. When I first got involved, the quality was terrible. The quality was terrible, and so we had to start working through that. The other 5 areas were actually quite good. But here's what's interesting. What do you think happens when you focus on one area? What do you think happens to the other areas? Yeah, they start to slip. And so what would happen is I would start focusing on quality, and then, of course, our cost might have changed. And then I would start, we get that under control, and by then our customer service is going to hell. And so in order to serve our customers better, I had to raise the amount of inventory that I had. So what does that do to my asset management? Well, that goes to hell, right? You see how this works? And so this is, I don't know if you've seen those old videos of those guys that spin plates on poles, and they've got like 6 of them spinning at the same time, and they have to keep going around, putting a little more spin on each one of them to keep them going. That's the job of a manager. And I was so innocent when I started this. The guy that's walking me around, he's supposed to be my mentor, and he told me, your problem's quality, you really got to get that. And I says, great, once I got that squared away, everything will be cool. And he says, no. He says, something else will go wrong. And I said, what? He says, I don't know, just wait. He was absolutely right. Now, how did we even know there were problems? Because we were measuring it. And so it's not actually just enough to measure stuff, then you have to take action. So we had action items and due dates. We would come up with a plan. What are we going to do to fix this problem? Does that make sense? Okay. Now, I got to wipe my nose. And then we'll get back to our slide. So the last thing up here that we haven't talked about is total asset turnover. And it's a measure of sales divided by total assets. The purpose of the assets at the firm are to produce revenue. Does that make sense? And if I've got assets laying around that aren't doing that, I should get rid of them. And so basically what we're looking at here is how well am I using my assets to produce sales? Now, there are two ways that oh, by the way, bigger is better. Does that make sense? The more sales I can produce with the same assets, the better off I am. So, two ways that we could increase total asset turnover. Do you know what they are? I mean, it's a fraction, right? You can either make the top larger or the bottom smaller. I'm going to give you a chance to redeem yourself. How do we make total asset turnover greater? Do we increase sales or do we decrease total assets?
We increase sales.
Did you say increase sales?
Oh, yeah.
Do you remember now? The answer is never increase sales. The answer is never increase sales. We're going to instead try to reduce our total assets. We're going to look around for assets that we're not using and we can sell them. Does that make sense? And I'll give you an example of a couple of car companies. I'm going to use Hyundai as an example of a good car company, though lately they've been making these Steal Me specials. Do you guys know about that? Where you can, with a phone charger cord, you can basically steal a Hyundai or a Kia. Go out and watch YouTube, just don't do it, right? Okay, so you can go out there and steal these things. That's not good. So let's back up to 2018, before all that crap started happening. Hyundai basically is utilizing their factories 100%, which means that they cannot sell more cars without building more factories, which they've done, right? Now, take another look at a different automaker. This one's called Stellantis. Has anyone ever heard of Stellantis? No? Have you heard of Dodge? Yeah, so Dodge is part of this former Chrysler stuff. And then there's also Fiat. There are some other kind of crummy car brands in the Stellantis family. To me, Stellantis sounds like an antacid. Stomach upset? Take Stellantis. Okay, but my point to you is this. Stellantis sucks. And so people don't want to buy their cars. I mean, they had to pull the Fiat 500 out of the U.S. market. Just took it out, right? Because it wasn't selling. So their factories are only operating at, say, 65%. So what could Hyundai do? Well, Hyundai could buy idle facilities from them, and it would help both of them out. Hyundai could make more cars, and Stellantis would have reduced its total assets and therefore improved its total asset turnover, which is going to improve return on assets and return on equity. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's what we're concerned about here, total asset turnover. How well are we using our assets to produce sales? Now, who's going to care about these things? Well, firm managers concerned about performance. Remember these kinds of things? This is one of those things that we would have been looking at too. In fact, here we are, right? And then also equity analysts and competitors. So the people putting the buy, sell, hold on your stock, and also your competitors to benchmark how you're doing versus them, or how they're doing versus you. Now, I promised you last time that I would tell you about how to manage receivables. And I'm going to tell you a true story. And you remember I told you I would always tell you if a story was bullshit. This story is absolutely true. I knew a man, he's dead now. I knew a man who had been CFO of a Fortune 500 company before it was Fortune 500. So he was there in the relatively early days, and the key raw material that this company consumed was steel. And so most of his suppliers were these steel vendors. And he was in charge of everything financial at the company, so he was actually responsible for paying the bills. And so here's something else I want you to know. Everyone every $1 in accounts payable that I have is $1 of accounts receivable to someone else. Does that make sense? These two things cannot exist separately in the universe. There are always a direct linkage between them. Okay, so here's what he would do. So he would get in these bills, and he would, by the way, this is before computers, so he has a typewriter. And he would type out the check, and he would stick it in an envelope, and he would type the address on the envelope, and then he would stick the envelope in his drawer. Now, the vendors were giving him 30 days to pay. When do you think he mailed the check? Day 29 is what I would tell you to do. Day 29 is what I expect you to do. It's a way to maximize this interest-free loan, and you're still living up to the terms of the contract you signed. Does that make sense? Now, the answer is no. How long do you think you waited? Say again? 30 days? No, longer. He actually waited until the supplier called and asked for the money. And here's how that conversation would go. The phone would ring. Hey, Jim, it's Frank over at Central Steel. I think maybe you forgot to send in your payment for last month's steel delivery. And the guy that I know would say, oh yeah. He says, don't worry about it. Check's in the mail. Click, open the desk drawer, grab the check, drop it in the mail. He said, I did that for 5 years, and only one supplier ever figured it out. Phone would ring on the 29th day every month. Hey, just reminding you, send that check. Yeah, no problem, check's in the mail. Click, opens the drawer. Whoop. Now, what's the lesson for you there for managing receivables? Do you just let the customer slide? No, you'd be amazed what can be accomplished with just a little phone call. Have you ever heard the expression, the squeaky wheel gets the grease? If you've got a wagon and it's got 4 wheels and you've only got enough grease to grease one of the wheels, and one of them is squeaking, which one are you going to grease? The squeaky one. And so if you are the supplier who's calling and asking for money and nobody else is, guess who gets paid first? Does that make sense? Okay, now, so the short answer is give them a call. I was doing some pro bono consulting. Do you guys know what pro bono means? Free, right? I was doing some pro bono consulting for a local farm. And they were doing these measurements, and under asset management, they had their accounts receivable, and it looked like this. It was just going up. By the way, this was during the financial crisis, 2008, 2009 timeframe. And it just looked like this. And I looked at it for 2 seconds, and I spun around, and I said, let me guess. You consider your customers to be friends? And they said, yeah, how did you know? I said, because your friends are taking advantage of you and your good nature to get this interest-free loan from you. But I'll bet your bank isn't loaning you money interest-free. And they said, no. And they were paying their bills on time. So, it's all on them. And so they said, well, what do we do? And I said, call them up. Ask for the money. And they said, well, we're friends. I'm like, look, I've got all the friends I need. What I need are paying customers, which I thought was funny because I was doing pro bono consulting for them, right? I got all the friends I need. I don't need more friends. What I need are paying customers. And surprisingly, when you call people, they'll usually cough up. I will tell you one more story on accounts receivable. I have a friend who has an engineering business, and he did some work for a local contractor who was building something for the Springfield School District. And the idea is, and actually it's not a contractor, it's an architect. And so after the architect gets paid, then the engineer gets paid. And this guy was just kept waiting, and he calls up the architect and he says, where's the money? And the architect kept telling him, oh, I haven't been paid yet. And then my friend said, you know what? I know so-and-so on the school board. I'll call them up and we'll find out what's going on here. Can you guess what happened next? Yeah, they've already paid me. I'll send you a check. Right? What a jackass. Do you remember people are scumbags? Okay. So, would people rather pay you or rather not pay you? They'd rather not pay you. So it's your job to make sure that they do pay you. Does that make sense? By the way, a customer that doesn't pay, should you keep them around? No. You know, sometimes people talk about firing employees. It's okay sometimes to fire customers. And you as an employee, it's okay to fire your company, right? It's called quitting. And so never be afraid to walk away from something if it's a bad situation. And now let's talk about profitability measures. And the first one I want to talk about is called the profit margin. And this actually comes from our common size income statement. It's just net income divided by sales. You can think about this ratio as how many, so it's it's how many cents per dollar of sales we're dropping to the bottom line. And let's ask this question. What do you think is a better way to increase your profit margin? Would it be to increase your net income or decrease your sales? Yeah, increasing net income, because decreasing your sales would be very hard to do without impacting your net income. How are you going to decrease that net income? The best way, or increase the net income, the best way is to cut your expenses. And what kinds of expenses do we seek to cut? Non-value added expenses. Or NVA. We want to cut NVA. So let's talk about what kinds of things are non-value add. What about the quality of the ingredients that you use? Is that a good place to start cutting costs? No, why not?
Because your food will taste different?
Yeah, so here's an example. Back during the financial crisis, my wife and I are walking through Walmart and I smell cheap chocolate. And I said, ugh, cheap chocolate. And I looked down and there is a big old display of Hershey bars. Hershey bars are supposed to be decent chocolate, right? Now, here's what you need to know. Good chocolate, the big difference between good chocolate and cheap chocolate is that good chocolate, they leave the cocoa butter in. In cheap chocolate, they sell the cocoa butter and they substitute vegetable oil. And you can smell it, you can taste it, it sucks, right? Now, do you think Hershey made a good call swapping out vegetable oil? No. Hey, if I want cheap chocolate, you know what? I'll buy cheap chocolate and I'll pay less than I'm going to pay to Hershey. So it didn't make sense for them to have cut their costs in that way. Okay, so there are a lot of things that I can't touch because now I could go out and negotiate with suppliers to get my cocoa butter cheaper, right? But I cannot cut out my quality ingredients because I'm going to hurt my sales. Now let's talk about what non-value added expenses look like. Let's talk about packaging. Anytime that I buy something from Amazon that comes out of China or Asia more typically, they just have all this premium packaging. There's like all this packaging and then you get down to this little $7 thing, right? So even when I order these dog collars that's supposed to keep my dog from barking, when I get them, they're in this magnificent packaging. Now, do you think that I really derive value from premium packaging on a collar I'm going to put on my dog? No. Now, they're for luxury brands like Tiffany. Do you guys know Tiffany? Not the singer-dancer woman, but the jewelry store. They're famous for their Tiffany blue, the box, right? And it's so funny because when my Chinese friends get engaged, what they do is they put out a picture of them holding the box and then the ring. So you know that or at least you think it does. Maybe they just got the box, who knows, right? But that box, that packaging is important. You can't skimp on that. iPhone, you're paying as much for an iPhone as a used car, right? You kind of expect it to come in nicer packaging than when you buy a Moto or whatever. But for a lot of things, the packaging, premium packaging, is a waste. Also, let's talk about an automotive assembly line. Do you guys know what spark plugs are? So if it's a V8 engine, it's going to have 8 spark plugs. And if anybody here ever changed their own spark plugs? Okay, when you buy the spark plugs, how do they come packaged?
I've never actually bought them, I just did it for work.
Oh, okay. Okay, so you were doing it, okay. So,
I was like, my granddad always just tossed them to me in a bag, so.
oh! Okay,
Comes in
so,
a cardboard box.
yeah, so they come in a cardboard box, and then each individual spark plug is in another little box, right? Now, I will tell you this, one time my dad made a splint for a cat out of one of the little boxes, which is the only positive use I've ever seen out of one of those. But, think about assembling these things on an engine line. The engines are coming down there, and do you want to have to remove the packaging? And no, it's actually costing you more money and time and impatience, right? And so what could we do? We can make an arrangement with the customer that we would send them reusable packaging. And we're going to have all 8 spark plugs laid out on a tray. And when that tray is empty after every engine, they toss it over into a big box. And when the box is full, guess what? It comes back to us and we put more spark plugs in it. And so we can reduce our packaging cost to basically 0. We just have to pay for those trays the first time, and then we're done. So that's non-value added expense. I'll tell you about another non-value added expense. When I first started to work for Halliburton, our plant in Duncan, Oklahoma looked like this. We had the dock where things came in, and we had the dock where things went out. And we would have raw material that would come in here, and it would end up going all over the plant and getting different operations performed on it before it finally made its way here. We would track some of these things. This is called a spaghetti diagram. And we would see that some of this stuff traveled like 3 to 5 miles inside the plant before it left, even though the plant was not 3 to 5 miles long, right? And so there's a lot of effort being wasted here while we move stuff around with a fork truck. By the way, we have to pay the guy to run the fork truck, we have to buy the fork truck, we have to maintain the fork truck, and then we have to, we're going to have accidents because that always happens with fork trucks. If you guys see me out in the hallway before I turn a corner, I always poke my head out and look. And it's trained into me from being in the factories. Otherwise, you could get stuck by a fork truck, right? Okay, so my point to you is, this is a bad deal. What would be better? What if we could have conveyors? What if we would line up the operations within the plant to where they actually flowed in a logical manner? And instead of putting stuff on a pallet, you guys know what a pallet is? Instead of putting stuff on a pallet and having a fork truck drive it across the plant, what if I could just set it on some sort of gravity roller conveyor and it would just roll down to the next operation? That's going to cut my cost tremendously. Does my customer care one bit? No, it's another non-value added expense that we can reduce. And when you reduce those expenses, you increase your net income, you increase your profit margin, and we haven't impacted our customer adversely in the least. In fact, in the case of the reusable package, we helped them out. Does that make sense? Okay, now let's talk about EBITDA margin. We discussed EBIT or EBIT last time. And so we know that EBIT stands for earnings before interest and taxes, right? Earnings before interest and taxes. What do you think DUH is? Very good, depreciation and amortization. Now, we know what depreciation is, I hope. If you don't,
Expense.
you don't know what depreciation
I
is?
said a non-cash expense.
Oh, a non-cash expense, you're right. But where does it come from? Say again?
Your assets.
Yeah, so when we buy assets, right? So here's the difference between, one of the many differences between finance and accounting. We go out and buy a $100,000 machine. The finance guy says that's a $100,000 cash outflow. And it is. But the accountant says, wait, that $100,000 machine is going to provide us economic benefit over a 10-year period. Therefore, we need to spread that expense over that 10 years. And so instead of recognizing that $100,000 right up front, what does the accountant do instead? They want to charge $10,000 of depreciation every year for 10 years. Does that make sense? That's why depreciation is a non-cash expense. We've already paid the $100,000 for the machine. Okay, now it's a non-cash expense, and you're absolutely right. That's the reason we're adding it back here. And then amortization. Here's one that a lot of people don't know because it's very rarely used. But if you're doing mining or forestry or an oil well, basically this amortization is based on, it's like depreciation, only it's based on the percentage of this thing that you've used up. And so if we've got a forest of trees that we're planning to cut over the next 5 years, if we cut 20% of those trees every year, then we'll be amortizing 20% of the value of that. So it's very similar to depreciation. It's the same idea. Of course, you still had to pay the cash for the forest up front. And so that amortization is also a non-cash expense. Okay, so here we go. We've got our earnings before interest and taxes, and we're going to add back depreciation and amortization, and that's going to give us EBITDA. Why do you have to add those things back? Because they've been subtracted from EBIT. Now, why in the world, so by the way, this is sort of an operating profit margin. Go ahead and write that down. That's an operating profit margin, this EBITDA margin. And the reason that we do that is because you could have two different companies, a brand new company with brand new machines. They're going to have high depreciation. And you could have an old company with old machines. They're going to have low depreciation. The new company might owe quite a bit of money. They're going to have a lot of interest. The old company might not owe as much money, and so their interest expense would be lower. So what does that mean? You could be looking at two companies that are otherwise identical. Their operations are otherwise identical, and their profit margins could be vastly different. The profit margin for the old company with old machines and low debt would be much higher, even though operationally they were just as efficient as the other company. Does that make sense? And so if I'm going to compare between my new company and someone's old company, what I want to look at instead of profit margin is this EBITDA margin, which is my operating profit margin. It talks about the efficiency of my operations, not how new my machines are, not how I'm financing my assets. Questions? By the way, when I got my operation in 1997, every single one of the machines had been totally depreciated out. My depreciation was zero. And so it looked quite profitable compared to a similar operation that would have had all new machines. Okay, now let's talk about return on assets. So remember that the goal of financial management is to maximize shareholder wealth. And so we're going to go through this capital budgeting process where we purchase assets. We're going to choose the assets with the goal of bringing the absolute most value to the shareholders we can. And so one of the accounting measures of how well we're doing that is return on assets. Can I tell you for sure what ROA should be? Not generically. Think about it on a per industry basis. So for banks, the assets are huge, right? The return on assets is actually quite small. It's like 1.5%, 2% small. What about for a software company? Maybe more like 50, 60%, right? So it would be, or it'll be much higher. So my point to you is this, that the ROA will depend on industry, so much like all these other ratios too, right? And I was wrong on that 50, 60%. That's profit margin for software. Okay, now return on equity. Return on equity is also going to vary across companies, but let's talk about how it's related to return on assets. We have to erase some bad art here. Don't you dare. Okay. ROA is equal to, well, actually, ROE. ROE is equal to ROA times the equity multiplier. And I'm going to prove that to you. ROE is net income. Net income over total equity. And what's ROA?
Net income over total.
Very good. Net income over total assets. Okay. What's the equity multiplier?
1.
Sometimes it is, if it's an all-equity firm. But what's the formula for the equity multiplier?
Total debt plus, divided by total equity plus 1.
Okay, so it's the debt-to-equity ratio plus 1, also known as total assets over total equity. Total assets over total equity. That's the easiest formula for equity multiplier. Now, what happens here to the total assets? Yeah, they cancel out. So, this equity multiplier, 1 plus, as she pointed out, total debt over total equity. As the debt increases, the equity multiplier goes up, and ROE climbs away from ROA. Going back to your example of an equity multiplier of 1, that's a firm with no debt whatsoever. In that case, ROE is equal to ROA. Why? Because all the assets are financed with equity. Let me say that one more time. In a firm with no debt, ROA is equal to ROE because all of the assets are financed with equity because there's no debt. Okay, so getting back to our example of the bank total debt, it's basically 9 to 1, 9 over 1 debt to equity ratio in a bank. Did you notice that banks were that indebted? About 90% of their capital structure is debt. And so 9 plus 1 means 10. And so if this ROA was 2% and the equity multiplier is 10, then the ROE is actually 20%. Does that make sense? Okay, now, I usually start out with this question. Would you loan money to a firm that owes 90% of its capital structure, or is 90% debt? Would you loan money to that? Typically the answer is no. I can't remember your name, but I like your shirt.
Jared.
Jared, okay. So you say no, and then I ask this question. Do you have a checking account? You are loaning money to an organization with that kind of capital structure. Your bank has that kind of capital structure. The deposits you make are loans to the bank. You are part of that. Now, why can banks get by with that? Because banks have a well-diversified set of borrowers, and they have a well-diversified set of depositors. And so they can run on situations like that. If you look at electric utilities, you're going to see that they tend to run more like 50% debt. Now, their business is pretty stable, but it does change seasonally, right? So in my electric bill this time, my utilities bill was $374, which is way too high. But this summer, it got up over $600 because I was watering the yard. Now, do you see what's happening with the cash flows there? They're seasonal. So if you've got seasonal cash flows, it impacts your ability to make these fixed debt payments, right? And so what you'll see is firms with steadier cash flows, like banks, depend more on debt. Firms with less steady cash flows depend more on equity. So let's say that you're a startup and you are planning to come up with the next kind of battery chemistry to replace the lithium batteries that are in all these electric cars today. Are you going to be operating on equity or debt? Well, you've got no cash flow coming in other than what investors are putting in. You can't afford to make these fixed debt payments. You don't know when this thing's going to take off. You don't know when you're going to make the breakthrough. And so these startups tend to be 100% funded with equity. And the more established a firm is, the safer its business is, then the more debt you can take on. In the beginning, Apple, 0 debt. And in fact, as long as Steve Jobs was alive, I think they stuck with 0 debt. As soon as Steve dies, though, they're able to say, look, we can take on some debt here because we know we've got these big cash flows that we can depend on, right? And so then they were able to take on some debt. Okay, now let's see. Who cares about these things? The same group of people that cared about the last ones. So my unit, it was weird. My customer was actually an internal customer, so I didn't get to talk so much about profit margin because my price wasn't the final sales price. But I did have a comparison to what I could sell it to the internal customer to versus what I had paid to create it. And so it was a similar measure. So we looked at this sort of stuff. And then also the equity analysts and competitors. I don't know why it keeps doing that. Okay, now let's talk about earnings per share. In accounting, if I say the earnings of the firm, what are the things of the income statement am I talking about? Which one of those things on the income statement am I talking about when I say earnings? I'll give you a hint. It's part of the formula. Yeah, net income. So when accountants talk about the earnings of the firm, they're talking about the net income. And so then I can divide that on a, by the way, who does that belong to? Belongs to the shareholders. So it makes sense to divide that by the number of shares, and that's going to give me earnings per share. Now, let's talk about comparisons. Does it make sense for me to compare the earnings per share between Google and Apple? It doesn't make sense, and here's why. You can have a random number of shares out there. You could have 2 identical firms, one that only has 10,000 shares outstanding, one that has 100,000 shares outstanding. The earnings per share of the first firm will be 10 times as much as the earnings per share of the second firm, with exactly identical operations, efficiencies, and everything else. And so it's not useful to try to compare earnings per share between firms. So what do? We compare it to the same firm over time. And remember we said when things are seasonal, it's important not to compare against the previous quarter. What we'll compare against is the same quarter last year, right? Same quarter last year. And if our earnings per share are higher than they were the same quarter last year, that's good news. If it's lower, that's bad news. Does that make sense? And let's see what else I can tell you about that. The other thing that's really important about earnings per share is about market expectation. If the market expects us to produce $1 per share, and we report more than $1 per share in earnings, our stock price is going to go up. What's the goal of financial management? Maximize shareholder wealth. So that means I should be pushing that share price up. If our earnings per share is below $1, that's going to push share prices down. And so this is the other important use that we see for earnings per share. There's comparison over time with the same company, and then there's whether or not you beat the expectations. Here's what's really funny. 2/3 of firms in the S&P 500 beat the earnings expectation. 2/3. Now, if we were consistently beating 2/3 of the time, shouldn't the equity analysts who come up with these estimates change their estimates? Right? If I'm consistently 3 degrees too low on my weather forecast, what should I do? Raise my forecast by 3 degrees, right? But they don't. It's consistent year after year after year. 2/3 of them beat. So I can't always trust those pesky equity analysts. Okay, now let's talk about price per earnings ratio. And that's where we take the price per share. By the way, where would I get price per share? This one's easy. Where would I get price per share for a stock?
The stock market.
Yeah, the stock market. It's just the stock price, right? So I can go out, Yahoo Finance, Google Finance, Wall Street Journal, so many places you can find a share price, right? And that's how you get your price per share. Divided by the earnings per share, which is precisely what we just talked about. And this PE ratio is going to give you a measure, and you can think of it this way. How much are investors willing to pay for willing to pay today for $1 of current period earnings? How much are investors willing to pay for $1 of current period earnings? Now, why would, by the way, this is usually, we're talking like 7 to 35, something like that. Why would someone be willing to pay more for the current dollar of earnings for some firms than they would be for the current dollar of earnings from other firms?
Because maybe one company shows more growth.
Yeah, that's exactly it. The faster this thing is growing, the greater that dollar is going to grow, right? And we know that it's the present value of future cash flows is the price of this darn thing. And so we are willing to pay more per dollar of current earnings if we think those earnings are going to grow faster. Thank you. Now, my Chinese students, they're very interested in, my China EMBA students, are very interested in the stock market. And so they always think they're going to come to my class and learn how to get rich. If you thought you came to my class to get rich, I'm sorry to tell you, if I knew how to get rich like you're thinking, would I be here? No, right? Okay, so here's what they do. It's like, should I buy low PE stocks? And I say, yes! And they say, ha, I have the answer. But then someone says, wait a minute, should I buy high PE stocks? And I say, yes! Now they're really confused. And someone else says, should I buy middle PE stocks? I say, yes! And now they're really confused. And I say, folks, buy them all. Buy them all. As we're going to learn in this class, a diversified portfolio is the best way to go, right? Does that make sense? And so don't let the PE of a firm scare you off. It still could go higher. So these are things that I don't even take into account when I'm investing. I own over 1,100 stocks. I couldn't tell you the PE ratio of any of them. By the way, do you know how I own 1,100 stocks? Yeah, I've got an S&P 500 and the S&P 600. You add 500 and 600 together, what do you get? 1,100, does that make sense? Okay. Now let's talk about the market to book ratio. And that is the market value per share divided by the book value per share. Let's talk first about how to get the market value per share. Any ideas? Say again?
Selling price of the share.
Yeah, it's just the stock price, right? We could have easily just written that stock price or price per share there for market value per share. Thank you. Now, let's talk about how to get the book value per share. It's a little harder. We are going to look at the total common equity of the firm. Okay, so we've got total equity, and so we're going to have preferred shares. So we'll take our total equity and we'll subtract out the preferred. Everything else belongs to the common shareholders, and we're going to take that total common equity and divide it by the number of common shares. And that is going to give us our and as I said, divide by the number of shares, that's going to give us our book value per share. The total common equity divided by the number of shares. Now, by the way, where am I going to find the number of shares? Well, I can find it at Yahoo Finance or Google Finance, the annual report, all sorts of places that I can go to find the outstanding number of shares. Now let's talk about market value per share. If this is less than 1, Warren Buffett says that's like handing the managers $1 and telling them to give you something less back in return. Let me say that again. If the market to book value is less than 1, that's like giving the managers $1 and expecting back something less in return. If this is your goal in finance, please bring all your dollars to me. I will make your dream come true. You bring me $100, I'll give you $75 in return. You bring me $200, I'll give you $150, right? Does that make sense? So in other words, this is a bad thing. It's a bad thing for people like you and me. Now, would it actually be bad for Warren Buffett to buy such a firm? And the answer is no. Does anyone know why it's different for Warren Buffett than it is for us? You guys know who Warren Buffett is, right? Really rich guy? Here's what you need to know about Warren Buffett. He's got a boatload of money, right? Do you have enough money to actually buy enough shares in a company to fire the old management and hire new management? I doubt you do, or you wouldn't be here, right? You wouldn't be here. And so Warren can do things that you can't. Warren can go in there and buy up enough of the shares to basically take over the firm and kick out the people who are doing a bad job and bring in people who would do a good job. Do you think, by the way, that Warren knows some people who would do a good job? He absolutely does. And so this is why it's okay for Warren Buffett to buy market to book less than 1, but not for you. I see these books that say, Investing the Warren Buffett Way. And that is such crap. And here's why. If the first page of the book doesn't say, start with several $billion, then you can't invest the way that Warren Buffett does, because you can't take over publicly traded firms. You can't go out there and buy up these private firms that the families don't understand what the true value of the firm is. You cannot invest the Warren Buffett way. So maybe the question you should ask yourself is, how did Warren Buffett invest when he was poor? If you could figure that out, then maybe you'd be onto something. But don't try to replicate what he's doing today, because you won't be able to. In fact, for most years, I beat Warren Buffett. Is it because I'm a genius? No, it's because I buy the S&P 500, and the S&P 500 outperforms Warren Buffett, at least some of the time, right? I'm not a genius, but you can outsmart Warren Buffett too, just by buying the S&P 500. Okay, now let's see what else we got here. Market to book value, of course, for firms with greater growth is going to be higher. How do we know if we've got a good market to book ratio? Compare us versus other people in the same industry. If the industry overall has a market to book value of 1.5 and we're at 1.7, woohoo, we're doing good. We're at 1.3, maybe we need to rethink our situation. Okay, market capitalization is just the price per share times the shares outstanding. That's also known as the market value of the equity. That is, the market value of the equity is market capitalization, same thing. And you'll hear people on business television like CNBC, they'll talk about the market cap of a company. It's just because they're too lazy to say market capitalization. That's what that's short for. But keep in mind, that only counts the equity. It only counts the equity. If a firm, you could have two firms with the same market capitalization. If one of them was on using 50% debt in their capital structure and the other one was totally equity, the firm with debt in their capital structure would be twice as big, in spite of the fact that they had the same market cap. Does that make sense? Okay, now let's talk about enterprise value. The reason I calculated market capitalization there is so we could get to this enterprise value idea. The enterprise value is basically what's the value of the operations of the firm itself. And we're trying to get out of it all this other kinds of stuff, like how we're financing that, those assets and how much cash we're sitting on. Because, by the way, if a firm is sitting on a boatload of cash, that's going to be reflected in the market capitalization. So we do a couple of things. We start out with market capitalization, and then we add the market value of the interest-bearing debt. Now, sometimes people wonder what the interest-bearing debt is. You can bet anything in the long-term debt section is interest-bearing, and you can typically ignore the stuff in the current liabilities, especially things like accounts payable. We know there's no interest on that. If there was something called notes payable, you might want to throw that in here with the interest-bearing debt. So now we've gotten rid of differences in how we're financing the assets, and then we're going to subtract out the cash, because the value of that cash, once again, is represented in the market capitalization, but it's not a true measure of the value of what's going on at the firm. What's the value of the operations? What's the value of the enterprise? And so that's why we have to subtract that cash out. Now, why did we figure the enterprise value? Well, we're going to take EV, which we just calculated, and divide by EBITDA. And the reason we're doing that is we're trying to come up with a measurement that is like price to earnings, only operational. It's an operational measure of PE ratio. So this is basically an operational PE. Now let's talk about how that is. That price per share represents the market value of the shares. Well, down here, this enterprise value represents the value of the entire enterprise. And then we're going to divide by that EBITDA, which we said is a measure of operating profit. So we got operations value divided by operating profit gives us something very similar to PE ratio, only focusing on the operations, getting rid of these complications of capital structure and the amount of cash on the books. The shortest class we have in this building is 50 minutes. You'd think this thing would go at least 50 minutes before it turned off. Okay, now, what's driving EV multiple? Why would one company have a higher EV multiple than another? And the answer comes back to what he said earlier. It's growth. Firms with faster growth will have higher EV multiples. Any questions? Okay, so let's do some final thoughts here on ratio comparisons. We should only compare between companies in the same industry. I've already told you some different industries and how they impact things. And sometimes you have to be careful even comparing between companies in the same industry if they have a different strategy. Let me give you some examples. Lowe's and Home Depot. Lowe's and Home Depot basically have the same strategy. They're going to buy a bunch of stuff that turns fairly quickly. And are they gonna always have everything that you need? No. Now let's compare this. So it would be good to compare Lowe's and Home Depot using ratio analysis. Not a problem at all. But let's talk about Ace Hardware. In theory, Ace is in the same industry as Lowe's and Home Depot. But the experience is quite different. So let me tell you an experience that I had. My wife said the toilet's making a funny noise. And we have these, they came with the house, these Toto toilets from Japan. Anyway, so I said, well, what kind of noise is it making? And she says, you know I'm no good at imitations, go listen for yourself. And so I go listen, and it's doing this. It's going, right? It's making that noise. I'm like, And so I lift the lid off. Here's your plumbing lesson for the day. I lift the lid off, and I look, and down at the bottom, there's this thing called a flapper. And that's what lifts up when the toilet flushes. And when that noise is happening, this bubble goes bloop, bloop. I'm like, aha, I need a new flapper. And so, and this one was like baby blue. And I go to Home Depot, and I'm looking at the wall of flappers. And they don't have any that are Toto specific, but they had this one that says Universal, but it doesn't look quite right, and it's red. And I'm standing there looking at it, and this guy, who's maybe 17 years old, wearing the orange Home Depot thing, comes up, he says, can I help you? And he smells like weed. And I say, yeah. Okay, here's my problem. I've got this Toto toilet. I need a flapper replacement. And I'm looking at this Universal. It doesn't look quite right. Do you think that'll work? He's like, of course it'll work, man. It's Universal. All right? I'm like, how did you pass the drug test to get in here? Apparently they don't test anymore. Back to the story. So what do? I do not trust Scooby or Shaggy. I don't trust Shaggy. So I head off down to the other hardware store that I mentioned, Ace, yeah. And they used to have this thing, their line was, Ace is the place with the helpful hardware man. That was back in the 70s. We've come a long way since then. Now we allow women to sell hardware. And so now Ace is a place with the helpful hardware folks. And so you go in there, and before I even get my foot in the door, they're like, welcome to Ace. Can we help you? And I say, yeah, I'm looking for a toilet flapper. And the guy says, what kind of toilet? I said, Toto. He says, what's it doing? And I says, it's making this noise. I said, bloop, bloop. He's like, oh yeah. He says, your flapper's bad. He says, you need a new flapper. In fact, I made the noise and he guessed it was Toto. That's how good this guy was, right? Okay, so he says, come with me. Now, as we're going back there, the aisles at Ace are really small. And that's because Ace tries to cram in a bunch more stuff as far as unit. Now, they're only going to have a few of each, but a lot more because they want to have it when you need it. Does that make sense? And so we get back there, and there's this huge wall of flappers. There's only like 3 flappers in each one, but there's this huge wall of flappers, and he goes, and he grabs one, and he says, does that look like it? I said, yeah, except for it's a darker blue. He said, let me guess. Your wife's been using those chlorine tablets in the tank. Because he knew it wasn't me, right? I said, yeah. He says, these are not chemically resistant. The chlorine attacks the flapper material, makes it brittle, turns it baby blue, and then it starts to leak. I'm like, wow, that's amazing. Now, a couple of questions. Do you think the inventory turns at Ace are as high as they are at Home Depot? Absolutely not. In fact, this flapper had some dust on it because it had been there a while because they were just waiting for me to show up. Next question. Do you think I paid more for the flapper at Ace than the universal flapper at Home Depot? Absolutely, I did. Now, you might immediately say, well, wait a minute, the profit margin is going to be higher at Ace. But keep in mind they had to hold on to that flapper longer, and there's one other thing. Do you remember the difference between the workers? We got Shaggy up at Home Depot, who reeks of ganja, and he's probably getting minimum wage. Now, how do you think this guy knew Toto the minute I went bloop down at Ace? He's a plumber, right? I don't even have to ask because I could see his. Do you guys know about the joke about? Okay. Right? Do plumbers make good money? If you don't know that, the answer is yes. And if you can't afford to send your kids to medical school, send them to plumbing school, right? Okay, plumbers make good money. Now, what does that mean for me as Ace? If I want to have plumbers in my store, how much do I have to pay them? Do I have to pay them the same as that they're paying Shaggy up at Home Depot? Absolutely not. I have to pay more, right? I have to pay them just enough to keep them from going and doing plumbing. It's like me at the university. I could make more money in finance, right? But they have to, so the university has to pay me at least enough to keep me from running off and doing that. Does that make sense? Okay. So what I'm getting to here is the inventory turns are different. The profit margin's likely different. The labor costs are different. There are all sorts of differences between these two companies that are theoretically in the same industry. So be careful. The second thing that I'll tell you is that you can't always apply a bigger or smaller is better mentality to ratios. So one of the things that you could do to increase your inventory turns is to reduce your inventory. But if you reduce your inventory too far, then you end up with something called a stock out. Any idea what a stock out is?
Less inventory.
Say again?
Less inventory means you are sold out.
Yeah, you're sold out. And so when I go to Walmart and I'm looking at, let's say the first thing I'm looking for is a watch battery, and they aren't on the hook. They're empty. Walmart doesn't know that they missed the sale of that watch battery. They have no idea, right? And so a lot of times, if it's an article that can be substituted, like sometimes I'll be going for the name brand of something and it's not there, so I end up with Great Value or Equate or something like that. Now, Walmart has still managed to make a sale. They've done so on lower inventory, but are they pleasing the customer? No. Are they maximizing their profit? No. And so you got to be careful. And so when we get into inventory management very deeply, we start talking about what kind of service level do you want to run? Do you want to be in stock 95% of the time for the items your customers seek? Do you want to be 99%? By the way, your inventory has to be a lot bigger to do 99% than it does to be 95%. These are questions you have to answer for yourself. But we do know that the smaller your inventory is, the lower that customer service measure is of how often you're able to please the customer when they show up. Let's talk about liquidity ratios. If a firm has a cash ratio of 5, remember the cash is just cash over current liabilities. If I am loaning them money in the short term, I think that's great. But what about for purposes of their shareholders? By the way, who are they responsible to? Their shareholders. What's their goal? Maximize shareholder wealth. Does that make sense? And so they have to think about how much that having that cash laying around is costing them. By the way, right now, if you've got cash in a checking account, what's it paying interest-wise? Yeah, very, very little. I finally moved some of my rainy day fund over into an account that's paying 3%. And I was thinking about going into a money market account that's been paying around 4.18% until this morning I heard one of the big bankers, I think it was Bank of America, he said, you know, there's a chance the U.S. will default on its debt. The majority of that money market firm were treasury bills. You think I'm going to buy that now? No, I think I'm going to stick with my FDIC insured 3% interest rate. But long story short, think about the kind of returns we expect out of the stock market. 5.8, 10, 12, stuff like that. And so we expect companies, when they invest, to be earning those kinds of returns. We do not, why would I give you my money to keep in your checkbook? It doesn't make any sense. If you've got that extra cash, what should you do with it? By the way, who does the cash belong to? The shareholders. So I need to, and I want to keep enough to make sure that I can run the business, but the remaining cash should be returned to the shareholders either in dividends or in share repurchases. And so a cash ratio that is too high says that the managers are sitting on too much cash. And one of the things that we say in finance is if we let managers sit on too much cash, they start wasting it. Think about this. You go out for a night on the town. You have $20 in your pocket. Your friend has $100 in their pocket. Who's more likely to spend freely? Aren't you going to be more careful with that first dollar even than your friend is with the 100? Because your friend with the 100 is like, yeah, I got $100. And I've heard this before. When I was at publicly traded firms, they say, yeah, we got all sorts of cash. I'm like, no, Jose, we don't have the cash, right? It's the shareholders' cash. But the thought is, you get to look at that, and then you're like, well, we really should upgrade the private jet because we're sitting on billions in cash, and yeah, it's just sitting there. We should really, because we deserve it after all, right? We're working so hard for these shareholders. We deserve that. So that's why I would tell you that those liquidity ratios, from the standpoint of the shareholders, you don't want them to be overly high. From the standpoint of someone loaning money to these people, you'd be thrilled for them to be high because all I care about is getting repaid. Does that make sense? Okay. Now we're going to talk about the DuPont identity, and we'll just get into it a little bit, and then we'll be done for the day. Actually, I'll start by telling you about DuPont, because some of you may not have heard of them before. DuPont was a very famous United States chemical company, and it was known for doing things right. I've actually been in a DuPont factory in Parkersburg, West Virginia, where they were making toothbrush, the bristles for toothbrushes. And they start off as a big, long strand, and I was really amazed at their process, because they make sure that there's basically very little that can go wrong. They buy good materials, they have solid processes, they have checks all the way along the way, so when you get a toothbrush, you know that the bristles are going to be just as stiff as they were last time. It's really a good company. And what I'm going to tell you about is an example of how DuPont is excellent at management. They used to have explosives factories. And my dad actually spent 40 years at a dynamite plant in my hometown of Carthage, Missouri. So, let me ask you this question. Do you think dynamite factories, that they put the entire factory in one building? No, why not?
You don't want gunpowder and anything flammable.
Yeah, so think about this. If trouble starts in this corner, and this place is full of powder and flammable stuff, what's going to happen? The whole darn place is going to go. So the one where my dad worked is just a line of buildings. And if one of the buildings shoots, that's what they call it, shoots. If one of the buildings shoots, the other ones are expected to survive. Now, at DuPont, they didn't have them in a line. They had them like this. But it's the same idea. Okay, now DuPont noticed that there were a lot of safety problems at the plants, particularly on the night shift. And let's talk about why the night shift is more dangerous than the day shift. When you are starting a job as a factory worker, do you start on the nights or on the days? Well, they probably train you on the days for a little bit, but then you're going to night. Because, right, there's someone on night shift that wants to come to days. They've got seniority, they get the day shift job, and suddenly there you are on nights. So the night shift is considerably less experienced. And also, during the night, you're supposed to be sleeping. I know you guys don't believe that, but it's true. And so the human body is not attuned to that. So there's two reasons here that night shifts are more dangerous, and they had a lot of explosions on the night shift. And so what they decided to do was build a lovely home right here in the facility, in the middle of the facility, and they told the plant manager that he had to live there with his family. What do you think happened to the accident rate? It went down. So let me explain to you how that works. If plant manager's at his house and a fire at his house in the city and the fire breaks out, he doesn't even know about it, right? But now him, his wife, his kids are all located in this house, and if he smells even a hint of smoke, what do you think he's going to do? He's going to jump up and like whoop, straight there to try to put an end to it. Does that make sense? The accident rate just plummeted. Just plummeted. By the way, the other reason the day shift is smarter than the night shift is because the stupid people get killed on night shift before they make it to the day shift. Isn't that sad? That's true. Okay, now, why am I telling you this? By the way, could you get by with that today? Absolutely not. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration would not allow you to put little kids and stuff, make people live. No, they wouldn't do that. But what I'm telling you is, these people at DuPont, pretty sharp. And they have come up with another way to keep managers in line. And it's called the DuPont ratio, DuPont analysis. And that's what we'll be talking about next time.